Okay, we are currently live on YouTube with no one else here.
How many people came to the first Faith and Humanities?
Well, the other thing though, Christian, you need to keep in mind is that actually a lot of people watch the Faith and Humanities, and that people are also not, why would you come to a Zoom meeting early? So here we go.
Right, that's what I wondered, is if
Oh,
Well, there's a few other people joining us.
yay.
Hey, all we need is like 2 or 3 are gathered. 2 or 3 are
you're
gathered.
already at 3, Christian.
I know, seriously.
Oh,
The Lord Jesus is in our midst.
Sam's there. We've already talked for an hour today. So, what's the blessing initiative idea? Woo.
What's your idea? Or
You're asking.
Yeah.
Oh, Sam, that's up to her.
Yeah. You might want to, I mean, you can do that here, but it will be.
I just wondered like the general topic.
Oh, yeah.
Sam, are you there? She's got her audio off.
Mm.
Yeah, it was. We talked to our potential partner. There she is, Sam. I said we were talking about the blessing initiative, and I said what was the general idea? Are you?
Yeah. So I think for me the most important part is how I even found this group, and how I found this group was, I thought I was going to be doing something especially related to issues of justice. And I was on LinkedIn, and it is, but not in the way that I thought it was going to be. So I was on LinkedIn, and this person who taught me how to use LinkedIn in 2009 and prior said, I just donated 25 computers to PCs for people, for students. Contact Rebecca and tell her that I sent you. And at that moment, as soon as I saw that, I was like, okay, God, is this it? Because I'd just been waiting. So I contacted Rebecca, and we have lots of interconnections. Her sister-in-law and I graduated from high school together. Her husband also went to Eden Prairie. They live in Edina, and she knows Colonial Church. And I just started asking her about what is PCs for people, and she told me, and I told her about our blessing initiative, and she was interested, and then connected me with her person, Mary, and that's who we met with. But I decided that something as important as the blessing initiative shouldn't just be one person in the community knowing about it. So I reached out to Betty and asked her if she would be willing to just learn about it and see what she thought, if it was even remotely, did it match the most basic things. And so today we had a Zoom, and it was really fun to see Betty's face. She was really like, I had never met Mary face to face, but Betty's eyes were like, oh my gosh, she gets it. She gets it. She gets it in Betty's wheelhouse, which is family education.
That's lovely.
So it was very fun for me.
Good.
Well, hi.
Hi. So what they do is they give, or they help everybody possible. They've been around for 19 years. They're a social enterprise, and they help individuals and families throughout the country have access to technology and internet connection.
Low income families.
Yeah, low
that's
income,
great.
200% below. Yeah.
Well, that is also a good plug for all of us and anyone who ends up watching on YouTube, that the Blessing Initiative is live and taking applications. And so getting your application. Oh shoot, I'm in the wrong room. I need to go to a different space. I forgot my spouse is in class and I'm upstairs.
Yeah, I'm going to be hopping around tonight too.
Um,
We're moving around.
The things of COVID land that you forget about.
Well, we will, like, as you make your migration, Sarah, we'll give a couple more minutes to folks to like
Oh, well,
sign
yep.
in and whatnot.
So, but I'll kick us off with just kind of some of the introductory comments, and then that way whoever comes doesn't have to miss the, so I'll just, a couple of introductory comments, and then I'll open us more officially in prayer. And so just thanks for those of you who are here and those of you who will also end up joining the conversation. Just really grateful and appreciative of this. And some of you noticed you've been in the conversations that we've been having. But, you know, really like our goal in this space is really as people who are following Jesus, to really be intentional about wrestling together with what does it mean to live and follow Jesus and love our neighbors in this time. And so, you know, I think particularly, I'll speak for Christian very rarely, but in this moment I will. The point with any of these readings and the invitations is really just that sense of wanting to invite us to sit in that posture of humility and openness to listen and to be prayerful and discerning together as we look for God's Spirit's invitations, and, you know, where might God be inviting us individually and collectively as community. And so just really grateful to be in this space and to just open this time with some intentional prayer. And so I'll just invite us as we gather tonight and are together, let's pray together. Okay. Jesus, we thank you that you are God of all love, and that you have fashioned all of us in your image. And God, that your grace is that which is always unfolding and inviting us to be encountered by you. And so on this night, might we wrestle in the good ways that leave us with little glimpses of encounter, but ones that make us more fully alive so that we might participate with you and continuing to be part of your kingdom coming. And God, we give you thanks that your body is a body that is diverse and that is made of people of all races and all nations and all places. And so might you give us wisdom that we might be your people. Be with us, O Christ, and by your Spirit. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Reverend Christian, will you bring us into some kind of just grounding for how we'll roll our time together?
Yeah. Thank you for those comments. That was awesome, Sarah. I'm gonna basically hit the mute all, which I think pretty much everybody's muted as it is. But just a couple of things. Like we're a small enough group. I think this is going to work really well, and we're going to kind of have good conversation. I know some of you have been able to read the book. Some of you have read part of the book. Some of you haven't been able to read much of the book, but you're kind of familiar with the basic arc of argument. And so I think as we kind of interact with one another and we bring some things up, we should have some really good conversation. I was just going to sort of encourage, these are not ironclad rules, but they're sort of encouragements for us as we talk through. My kind of inclination is for us to just kind of move through the book, like let the book be the guide, and let's just have a conversation about things that we've noticed in certain chapters. And I'm going to kind of move us through in that regard. I'll probably pretty much skim the first chapter, and then we'll jump in really starting in chapter 2. And as we move through, there's some places and spaces that I've picked out that I thought were interesting and worth talking about. And I'm hoping that you will have comments in that regard as well, and questions. I'm hoping that Vicky and Bill will be able to join us so we can see them. But even if not, we'll love to hear your comments and questions. There's also, I think, some other stuff outside, and I'm super happy actually to see Michelle. I'm super happy to see all of you here, but I'm also super happy to see Michelle here because one of the things that when I was reading this book that I was I was kind of sort of semi-disappointed was that Minneapolis didn't play as much of a role in the commentary, in part. And the reason why I was disappointed was not because it doesn't have a place, but precisely because it does. Like, it's part of the story. Some of the very same dynamics that we read about in the book also take place in some of our own neighborhoods. And I think being able to root things in that regard are important. And so this is why I connect to Michelle, because she's done some work in that area. She's familiar with this project called Mapping Prejudice. I've had some chances to read a couple of documents and articles that kind of bring us in, but
Did Christian freeze or did I?
just share insights
Oh,
here and there.
okay.
Looks like I
think
have I gotten, okay, am I back now?
yeah, you're back. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
it's
I think we caught. I
it's-
think we caught basically what you were saying, which is like partially. Michelle, in particular, you're aware, has done some work with Mapping Prejudice. I think some others may be familiar. I'll post in the comments some links as well. But yeah, so continue, sir.
Awesome. Okay. Sorry about that. I keep thinking that my internet is stable, and then my computer tells me that my internet is not stable. And so that's so. So I kind of want to skim over the first. So just so this is what we're talking about, the color of law. I'm hoping that you have your copy there. I feel like the first chapter opens up and gives to us like if they can do it here, they can do it anywhere. It's not as systematic and it's not as focused as some of the later chapters are. And so it has more of a story function than necessarily an analytical function. And I think it would be worth saying, just in based on the intro, that this book is attempting to provoke a conversation that goes well beyond just understanding the nature of housing discrimination, right? I think what you get in the first chapter from Richard Rothstein is a sense that he believes that if one can prove that the federal government, state and local governments, through actual legal actions, particularly since the Second World War, that's the area where I think it's the most engagement, that if those actions actually led to the basically dispossession of African American communities in particular, then you have the basis for something that probably looks like reparations. So I would, and so we don't necessarily have to talk about reparations tonight, but I think it's important just to name that I think that that's part of the background conversation that Rothstein is having. He's trying to provide a legal blueprint for a conversation for why the Supreme Court in particular, not the court of public opinion, but the Supreme Court should be willing to consider that possibility. Okay. So I think that should at least be put out in terms of motivation for the conversation that Rothstein is developing and having. And I think that's what keeps the narrative arc, the spine of his argument. I think that's kind of it helps us to understand the shape of what he's trying to argue and why he follows the story that he follows, precisely because this is sort of what he's after to a certain extent. So there are places where we might wish that he'd gone in a certain direction. He doesn't go in that direction. He goes in a slightly different direction, perhaps. I don't have any examples in that regard. I'm just saying theoretically. And the reason is because, and he sets this up very clearly in the introduction, so it's not really a surprise as you're reading the book. So just to keep that in mind. So chapter 1 then becomes sort of an argument. If they can do it in a place like San Francisco, then they can probably do it anywhere else. And the premise of that is that San Francisco obviously we're operating from like a, late 20th, early 21st century understanding of San Francisco, is that it represents, a city of tolerance and progress and inclusion.
Hey, Christian, you went away again.
With
Not that you can like fix it if I tell you.
Okay, I don't want to lose you too much.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'll pause as I need
So you
to.
you
I think
stopped
I'm in
you stopped at the part where you said that there's kind of this notion in the country at our present time that's pretty agreed upon, that San Francisco is like this liberal city, right? That's where you
Right.
cut off.
Yeah, and so that was my main point. So if you can do it in San Francisco, you can do it anywhere else. And then he gives to us a story rooted in the war period of Second World War and post-war that shows that housing was segregated by federal policy, right? And that becomes then the basis for kind of jumping off in a sense. I don't know. So the way that I kind of like to curate these conversations, and that's really how I feel about myself, is I'm trying to curate a conversation as opposed to dominate and lead, is simply to kind of raise questions like, are there is there anything things that struck you from the first chapter, things that you underlined that you wanted a conversation about? If there's not, I'll skip us on into the second chapter. And I think when we get into the second chapter, basically chapters 2 pretty much up to chapter 10 is really kind of the heart of the argument, where we get various different angles that Rothstein is kind of after in terms of developing making his case, basically. So I'll kind of throw it open, and you can feel free to unmute yourself as you have questions or.
Sam?
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know for sure if it's this very first chapter or soon thereafter, where these agreements are made with in order to get votes for a certain something or another. And I think it was Georgia that then really what housing for African Americans was the card. Like, I will vote for this that you want, as long as you make sure that we have segregation and it isn't illegal. And that's what I'm looking for here, is this example. And I don't know if it was, I just remember being so blown away by that it's like currency. It was like, it became housing for African Americans, and actually precluding it was what people would use as a negotiating tool to get votes for something that they wanted. Like, okay, I'll vote yes for your thing, as long as you make sure we always have segregation. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, this is awful. And in fact, I remember writing about how horrible we are as people. Right in the book, like, we're horrible people that we would even go down that path. I wrote, we're cruel. Human beings have trafficked one another through slavery since 1619 in this country.
Was there a particular page like early on that you connected that to?
Yeah, this is on chapter 3. Oh, here it is. So I'm sorry, it's up in chapter 3 with racial zoning. Elected politicians use people as bargaining chips.
Yeah.
Page 39.
Yeah.
On the bottom, page 39. So sorry, that isn't chapter 1.
You just did the
I
preview.
couldn't find it.
No, it's okay. And I think we can kind of work with a sense of, if we need to, the first, section of the book, and then second section, we can also do that.
Okay, so
Uh,
I'm mortified by this.
Which part?
That
Yes.
we have elected politicians have been using people as bargaining chips. And their housing and segregation. And I keep thinking, in fact, I think I posted some pages on a Facebook about today's history lesson, and history looked like today. I feel hopeful, but I can't stand that. And my, of course, question is, and my wonderment is, how can we interrupt this so we don't repeat it?
Well, let's start. It looks like Elaine's got a finger. I think let's start with some initial responses, and then we can also think about interruption questions. Elaine, what did you have a comment about?
I'm not sure which category my comment falls into, but my wonderment about all of this is it's 100 years after so many of these activities happened. It's been 100 years. And this is kind of the first time as a community we've started looking at this stuff or learning about this stuff. And the other wonderment is, how come most people aren't at all interested in learning about this stuff?
I just said, Sarah, I'll let you take that one.
Jesus. No, that's the answer to the question in every Sunday school class, right?
That's right.
But no, I really appreciate that. And I think that's part of why we wanted to wrestle with this. And I think Christian, in talking about this book, was that this isn't something that many of us necessarily are familiar with, some of these histories, and some of us maybe, but just to wrestle with, in view of these histories, like what does it ask of us as people who are following Jesus? And I think that was the thing I would say from just the first chapter. I mean, I appreciate your summary of it and don't disagree with it. I think like one of the things from that very first chapter, and actually from the what do you call it, preface he has here too, is that sense of how this really isn't just a given. Because I think that's kind of how I was raised, is like, it's just kind of a given that like segregation is just like, racial segregation is kind of a thing. And, there's all this stuff, like, I just think back to being a kid that I was trying to make sense of. But I really appreciate how he's trying to say, like, no, like this actually, there are policies and things that happen. And I just think like one thing for me that, he's starting here in San Francisco, in my dissertation that I'm working on right now, because I'm talking about our context. And one of the things that I learned in doing some research on Edina is that, Edina often shows up in South Minneapolis, which Michelle could, has done some work with that, with the mapping prejudice, and we can talk about that in racial covenants section. But that wasn't Edina's original founding. Like Edina, actually, it was originally actually a place where there was a religious community there, and it was multiracial. And that was actually the case until actually some of the housing covenants and some of the movement happens, right around World War I in that time. And so I think that's like, just appreciating that that's where he's starting, is this sense of, he is trying to help us to think, like, to understand that this isn't an inevitability. It isn't actually even historically, it's not actually a historical truth. It's something that is designed. So
Yeah, I think this is one of the most, there are several really important things, and I'm kind of concerned that I'm going to say this now, because I kind of was hoping to save it for later, but who knows, I may not have a space to say it. But I think two of the most important parts of this book, one of them is is driving home the historical contingency of all of this, that it didn't have to be the way that it is. And once you realize that it's historical contingency, that raises the question that, okay, it could be potentially unmade. We could work for something different. And I think, to me, that is one of the most important lessons to learn when we read these books. We will learn lessons like how to have grief. We will learn lessons like how to be sad about the way that things have developed, and that's important. But it's not just that; it also is the historical contingency. I don't think we get in this book as much. Like, another lesson that you might draw on that is oftentimes resistance that you see. So all along the line that you see the kind of creation of a racial hierarchy or racial regime, etc. You also will find resistance stories, and I think that's an important component. We don't hear as much about that, but the contingency part, I think, is really, really important to sort of, from my perspective at least, to internalize. The second thing that I think is really important, which I think is what, Sam, you're kind of putting your finger on in some respects, it's the nexus of race, power, money, race, power, economics, that these things kind of intersect. And I mean, I know this looking kind of longue durée, like, I mean, it's effectively slavery that creates race. It's not race that creates slavery. And what is slavery? It's the kind of economic exploitation of cheap labor, right? And so you really do see a lot of that here, in terms of housing values and other kinds of questions, creation of wealth, those kinds of things. I think that's important. I don't know if this gives us kind of an actionable element in the same way of the contingency piece, but just seeing the way that, like, economics is never very far away from questions of exploitation and or exclusion, and even if it's sort of more muted, it's clearly a component part. And I think this is something to keep in mind as we're kind of thinking through the questions here, around this book, and
Michelle?
sort of the things it has to say. Yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, even though I'm his favorite, I haven't actually read the book yet. I listened to the podcast. But one of the things that I'm hearing in this conversation already is also, kind of the outrage that these practices, came about, and how, systems came about to suppress people from being able to own homes. But also the narrative that I was taught growing up, that everyone in America had a chance. All you had to do was work hard, and then you could point to like a Bill Cosby or whoever was like the one Black person who did really well, and be like, see, everyone can do it. And so many of the movies that I remember seeing in like the 90s and the 2000s is like, it's like Boys in the Hood. It's, these gangs. And if these guys just would stop being in gangs, and if the dads would stay home and help take care of the family, then everything would be okay. And not ever being told that there were all these layers that oppressed the whole kind of system of being able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Well, and that is where, and he'll get more into this as you, Christian, bring us into subsequent chapters, but actually it's in chapter 1 where he kind of first starts to name this. I'm on 13, where he says at the time, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration not only refused to insure mortgages for African Americans in designated white neighborhoods like Ladera, they also would not insure mortgages for whites in a neighborhood where African Americans are present. So that's right. That's what he's starting to begin to say, is like, is to kind of poke at that, to say, hey, like, there, like, literally there were systems in place and in our law that, and he's like, I'm not here to guess what people's emotions or other things that are going on. I'm just here to try to figure out what's going on. So
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things, and I'll just to kind of as we begin to transition to chapter 2, like just the bread and butter considerations, right? I mean, if you can't get an FHA backed mortgage, you're going to have to pay more. You're not going to be able to afford certain other kinds of things, in terms of diet, in terms of upkeep of your house, in terms of a whole host of things, and you can kind of see the cascading effects, I think, once you kind of bring it down to just those bread and butter economics, which I think I know what that feels like. I'm just not very good at it. And what I mean by that is just the budgetary things that I think a lot of other people are much better at. They know how to navigate that personally in ways that I'm not quite as good at that. But once you start thinking about, okay, if I don't have enough money, to pay enough gas to make the 1 hour commute, the fact that I have to get up for an hour each way to go to work, what is that? The kind of the way that would drag on the body, and the way that you would then be able to be present or not present for your family. I mean, there's just so many like little existential pieces, I suppose, that you could bring in that then make these more kind of abstract, larger, systematic processes that we're talking about. Then you sort of start to see the kind of the human toll, and the ways that you can kind of, okay, now you can begin to understand why there's a wealth gap, why there's an education gap, why there are these different gaps, because it would simply not be existentially sustainable for anybody. Doesn't matter your race, your color, your creed, whatever, your gender, any of that stuff. It would just simply not be sustainable. So let me move this into chapter 2. I don't have a ton of comments here myself. Sarah might have a little more, just because chapter 2 deals with public housing. One of the things that the author traces is that public housing begins, in a sense, at the end of World War II, and is attempting to respond to a housing crisis that's happening in the country. We have to think about this in terms of World War II, people coming back from the war, the baby boom is beginning to happen. And so there's not enough affordable housing for people. And so the government decides that they're going to step in and start to build public housing. They typically begin by building what they call scatter site housing, which means different like I think it's like lower density housing, we might describe it, as opposed to sort of the single things that we eventually come to associate with public housing. And he tracks how this really starts out, essentially public housing starts out as a way of addressing housing shortages among poor whites, middle class and poor whites. And then over time, it becomes one of the key vehicles to create segregated housing. And eventually, I'm born in 1971. So I would say by the time I become cognizant, in the 80s, probably, when I'm starting to think about things and I can remember hearing things, when you talk about public housing, for the most part, you're probably talking about communities of color, at least in the popular imagination, right? So that's about 30 years or so after it starts. So that's kind of the overview of this section. I don't know if there are any particular passages that stand out to you that you want to talk a little bit about.
I would just share that, to go along with what Michelle said, that was my upbringing as well. So I noticed that when the gentleman needed to commute an hour so he could keep his good high-paying job, that what he did was he bought a vehicle and then basically sold seats to commute. He bought like a commuter van. And I thought to myself, that's what I was taught, be resourceful. And I thought, wow, he was so resourceful. He figured out a way to keep, even though there were so many barriers, he figured out a way to keep that good paying job. And how many times do we hear about that? Like, I was glad to have been told that, because that's not part of what I hear or heard very often or at all growing up, was, you know, only white people. That, I mean, that was basically the way it was pitched. Only white people know how to be resourceful. So that was one thing I just remember thinking, like, whoa, good for him. But to your point, anybody needing to commute, he didn't choose to. That's what's different. I also noticed the numbers of us that commute because we choose to commute is quite different than being relegated to commuting.
Right. Yeah. That building off of that first chapter, it's pretty clear that, like, it's not necessarily a choice. Or if it is a choice, it's not the person's choice. It was someone else's choice that forced that. One of the other things I think that layers into chapter 2 then is the fact that public housing pretty much, so it's that we're talking about the 40s, we're talking about post, and this, I think this is one of the striking things about the whole book, the way that the New Deal is described and talked about, and pretty much from chapter 2 on, you get a sense of, again, what Sam, you put your finger on, which is this need to trade. Like, we want to get this program through, but we're going to have to trade off the rights, dignity, and humanity of a certain group of people in our country. And I think some of that is very much rooted in Southern politics. And I think this is an important thing to acknowledge, in the sense of what sometimes in the literature is called the Plantation Block, and that just simply is a kind of reiteration of plantation politics, which is of course an anti-Black politics that also has an economic element to it, but that has now clearly filtered its way into other parts of the society. There's certain racist attitudes that are held by people, etc. And so when they're creating these various, like, soup of organizations, and here in chapter 2, we're talking about public housing authority, it is very definitely racialized from the very get-go. They're going to create certain types of buildings and settings for white families and others for Black families. And over time, that the whole kind of migrates, in a sense, and is opened up primarily to African American families. But it looks like there's a couple of comments of folks.
Oh, no, that's just for me. I'd put a bunch of links from some stuff related to housing in Minnesota. I think one of the things, like, for me in this chapter, the public housing Black ghettos is, and y'all kind of name some of this, is, you know, right away, this is one of the moments he's beginning to speak about the New Deal. And again, I just think back to, like, what I learned about the New Deal in my US history, AP US history class in 10th grade. And how, I mean, the New Deal, right? It's a good thing. And I know, like, for my family, it was a really good thing. Like, my gram was born in 34. They were, like, super, super poor, you know, like, what the New Deal had, you know, like, what happens for my family's lineage in view of the New Deal. But just how I think one of the things I appreciate about this text is he really, like he says in the preface, he's trying to take on the challenge that the justices had said, of basically prove it's de jure and or de jure, not de jure, sorry, not the soup of the day, and how he really is then pointing out how this happens, you know. So he's highlighting, here's what happened then right from the beginning with the New Deal. The administration constructs separate projects from African Americans and white folks. We see in the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a New Deal funded effort, where, like, this is on 19, how it says,
Which,
the village,
by the way, connects directly to my family. I'm sorry, but go ahead.
The TVA. Yeah, there's a lot with TV. Yeah. And so, right. But but how the village, which was funded through New Deal money, is only open to whites, and they have further away a place that's more shoddy for African American, for Black workers, and then their official response to that was, well, Negroes do not fit into the program. And so just how he like lays out how this kind of goes on from there in terms of what's happening with the public housing and the Black ghettos. And I think my dad also lived in St. Louis while I was growing up, and so that was one of the interesting things I remember as a kid too, like trying to understand, because I think I didn't have an awareness of racial segregation, like was like of like St. Louis, having grown up in Minneapolis. And when I would go to St. Louis, I was like, I knew it was a totally different world from where I was from, and how he's outlining like how this begins to happen in places like St. Louis, and yeah, and just like going forward, you know, through what's happening, of kind of like there's moves to like kind of deconstruct, and then there's pathways made around that to say no, like we're not going to actually deal with this, and just like how HUD is a part of this, and what's happening here, and how, you know, there's even this sense of like, if we move these this housing into middle class or white neighborhoods, how it's going to be destructive, and naming how it's like in putting this on these innocent people, and just how this has been a tension, you know, for a long time. And so and I think just the only other thing I'll say about that is, and some of you know this, like I grew up in Section 8 housing. So I grew up in public housing. I knew what HUD was since I was like 5, you know. And just, I had said this, like particularly when I lived in Bloomington, like that was what I moved to Bloomington in 5th grade, and they called where I lived. Like I got to school and they're like, "Oh, you live in the ghetto?" And I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. But that's like what my housing development was called by my 5th grade peers.
Mm.
And so just like, yeah.
Well, let's, we haven't heard from everybody yet. So I know we have some folks here. I've got several comments and thoughts, but I would love to hear from like John and John and Dagerbergs, Bill Strange, Vicky or Dick, whoever it is behind the Vicky Primuth. Other thoughts or comments regarding?
I'm kind of freeloading on this. I haven't read the book and didn't quite understand the process here. So if you don't mind, I'll coattail along in the conversation and read the book soon.
All right, brother, no problem.
Well, I haven't read the book either, but I was peeking at it, and I do have a little bit of experience with this. I was born in 1959. We moved to the near west side of Chicago in 1961, and so I wasn't too far away from the Robert Taylor homes, and not too far away from Cabrini Green. And you know, from 1960 all through the 60s, we were living in that area, and we definitely saw, you know, all the white people moving out of that neighborhood continuously all through the 60s and 70s, and friends of ours who lived there moved out and moved to the suburbs, and even African American friends that we had, anybody who could move out, moved out. I mean, my dad had his ministry in the near west side. He was committed to that area, so he stayed there until 1981, when I was in college. They finally moved out to Naperville. They had it by that time. Both my parents were just tired of all the, you know, robberies and things that had happened in the city, and my mom had been assaulted, and you know, it just got too much, you know. And it is what it is. It was you know, the guy describes it as just white flight and all that, and how crime developed, but it seriously, the crime in the city in the west side of Chicago got worse and worse. A lot of it had to do with access to guns and drugs. I mean, when I was growing up in like the late 60s, early 70s, I was probably mugged over 25 times in the time that I grew up. But most of the time when I was mugged, it was always just people coming up to you and rustling you up and asking you for your money. And I had one occasion with a knife, but that was it. You know, it became more and more people having guns and robbing you with guns. And the gang violence became escalated because the guns became more powerful. People had more access to guns. So there's a whole bunch of issues I'm sure he'll talk about in the book, but I had a little bit of experience with it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, John. I think one of the interesting things in that regard is, you know, like the creation and production of criminality, and particularly how it's linked to the exodus of jobs that happens along with that kind of white flight. And one of the things I found so fascinating, even in starting in chapter 2, is like, I think typically, like, so I'm from the South, and it's kind of a different dynamic perhaps maybe than what's happening in the Midwest or the North, but there's a general sense that, like, there's a grassroots set of assumptions that a whole host of people might hold about race and things of that matter, and they have gotten control of the apparatus of government to enforce their grassroots sentiments. But one of the things I found so interesting about the Rothstein book is, when we're talking particularly about other parts of the country, like the Northeast, the Midwest, the West, it really actually winds up being like a lot of it's a top-down enterprise, right? It sort of starts out with certain kinds of federal decisions, and then those decisions become state-run decisions. And I was struck, and I wish I'd gotten some more detail, because it's one of the first places that our state shows up. One of the few places, actually. It's on page 32, and it's talking about the ways in which state government winds up passing certain amendments to their constitutions and or their legal processes regarding the housing issue. And it says in about a dozen states, among them California, Iowa, Minnesota, Virginia, and Wisconsin, the few suburban officials, and so part of the issue here is, will we have public housing in the suburbs or not? The few suburban officials who may have wanted integrated developments were prevented by state constitutional amendments adopted in the 1950s that required a local referendum before building a low-income family public housing project. And so it's this kind of interplay between the local and the federal or state level that gives you a feeling that, like, this feels like a vice that's difficult, that would be almost impossible for someone to escape. And that's just in regard to, is public housing going to be desegregated? And then, of course, where's it going to be located? Right. And that's both of those questions they are interlocked, but they are distinct questions. Right. So if you're going to have integrated, that's one question. And if you're going to have the location question, right. And so that's going to hit on zoning issues. And that actually gets us into chapter 3. And so I think if we can kind of move our conversation forward into chapter 3, the title of the chapter is Racial Zoning.
Right.
And
Say one thing.
Go ahead, John. Yeah.
I was just looking at this book, and one thing that just struck me was on page 35, where he's talking about this case in Chicago, where the city of Chicago had blocked efforts by the CHA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development to comply with consent decrees and lower court decision. It had to do with just trying to put low-income housing in white neighborhoods, and the resistance that got at all different levels. It talks about Judge Bork, who apparently, Robert Bork was the Solicitor General for Ford at that time, and he was blocking it, but it also talks about Mayor Daley blocking it and how much resistance. And then the courts ultimately, made a decision. It sounds like it was in favor of making that happen, but it never is implemented, because at all levels, at the state, local, federal level, there is resistance to it. I mean, it is impossible to get anything done when every form of government is resisting you, from the city to the state to the federal government. How are you possibly going to make change?
Yeah, and the other thing, just layered in, is like Mayor Daley, a Democrat, Robert Bork, a Republican, right? So there's nobody that like escapes this process, as we like. There's no sort of array of like that we might typically. And I think this is one of the things about the New Deal part also that shows up. But I'm really actually interested, especially like it'd be marvelous. I wish you'd had a chance to read this, because Chicago is talked a lot about in this book. And I think it would be really fascinating to hear your experience having grown up in Chicago and the various areas that you grew up. I mean, the fact that you were mugged 25 different times, like that's news to me. And I think layers in a particularly important component that you would bring to this conversation. So I look forward to hearing what you think about this as you get a chance to read through it. So this chapter 3, on racial zoning, this is not yet about racial covenants, but we're getting kind of close to that. So racial covenants are the covenants that are kind of concocted in the 1920s and 30s that say that we will only sell houses to certain people. Typically, like the ones that we know of are almost always issued by white folk, and they're going to exclude primarily Jews and African Americans. I don't know if there are any comments or questions in this particular chapter, but it talks a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Christian, I think that for me, the very first 2 sentences, 2 to 3 sentences, we like to think of American history as a continuous march of progress toward greater freedom, greater equality, and greater justice. Backward, dramatically so. Residential integration declined steadily from 1880 to the mid-20th century, and it has mostly stalled since then. Well,
yeah,
we
just got an F+
right
on that. I mean, since 1880. So when I hear John's experience, it's like it's totally natural consequences to all of chapters 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Like, it just makes sense. Of course, that was gonna be the outcome based upon, if all you read was the first 3 chapters or 2 chapters, you'd go, well, gee, John, that sounds like about right, about what would be the likely outcome. The other thing that I would share is that some people know that my dad was, and mom, we have had a family scrap business, and my dad owned and operated junkyards, used auto parts and crushed cars. And they bought 5 acres 53 years ago. They bought 5 acres in Eden Prairie before it was a city. But no one, like my dad always said, everyone wants a flush toilet, but no one wants to live next to the water treatment plant. Everyone wants a car to drive, but they don't want to live next to the junkyard. And just in terms of that industrial zoning, and once, when that steel plant was burning in North Minneapolis, over this last year, all I could think about is there is another example of why are people living close to that? And right here, they talk about it again and some more. It's like, when I say we're cruel, it's like, okay, this is really an opportunity for us now. And this book is giving us everything that we need. If this is all you had, And this was the only body of literature that you had to say, gee, you know, we might, as a community, want to look at how we might interrupt this. Like, we've got a lot of evidence here. It's pretty clear. Like, John has an experience. I have an experience with the junkyard stuff.
Yeah, and I was
Sarah's
struck,
got her experience. Like, why is that being called a ghetto? Yeah, I mean, I'm just like, all of us, you know, all of us have an experience.
yeah, for me, my experience was we lived in New Jersey for about 4 years, just outside of Manhattan, and so you become attuned to sort of internal politics in New York City. And one of the things regarding, like, so part of the argument, there are a couple of things that are going on in this chapter. One is that racial zoning is clearly part of the post-Reconstruction backlash. Right, so the whole story starts with Rutherford B. Hayes, and the kind of white backlash against gains made by African Americans coming out of the Civil War, et cetera. It talks about Jim Crow in the South and sort of the development of some of those things as they kind of evolve and migrate into the North, and wind up eventually affecting federal policies. And so the zoning questions are ones that get worked out around questions of density. Are we going to have single family homes, or are we going to have more dense ability for people to live closer together? And so he parses out some of that stuff in here in ways that is, I don't know that I can deliberate more than simply to say that he traces some of this around socioeconomic, but also clearly it has a kind of racial, it winds up having very much a racial effect. But then he pivots kind of in the middle of the chapter. He talks about Ferguson and the creation of Ferguson just outside of St. Louis, and how he traces it back then. So he sets up that dynamic, and then he traces back, why is Ferguson what it is? And therefore, why then did we have an uprising resulting from the death and murder of Michael Brown, right? But then towards the end, the last third of that chapter is the one that you're talking about, Sam, which is this kind of environmental racism. And this is where I was just kind of thinking, I remember living, like I said, just outside of Manhattan, and one of the big debates was, why were all of the major bus installations located primarily in African American communities? And this is before you have non-diesel, more environmentally friendly. Like, this is clearly like you have significant pollutants being put into the air. There are studies that have already been developed from the 80s and 90s that show that people that live in these areas are more susceptible to asthma, et cetera, et cetera. And so that whole zoning question, that's kind of what he brings in, and he kind of demonstrates that communities of color are more likely to be zoned in a way that allows for industrial or other kinds of toxic waste. And we get other stories around this, like, if you probably know, maybe you've heard as an aside, like that most of the major nuclear waste sites in the United States are located very close to or on Native American land. And so that's a sort of similar kind of thing to the one that you're raising, Sam. And it seems to be a kind of lingering, like kind of residual result from this period, in which I think the idea, I mean, from my perspective, the idea is enclosure. It's this process of enclosing people and controlling them primarily for economic means, and not allowing them to have the ability to accumulate capital, not allowing them to have the ability to accumulate political power, et cetera. And the reason you want to do that is precisely to control that population for one reason or another. And I think invariably that tends to be economic, but that's my own theory. All right, that's my own personal theory. So I just put that out there, and you can take it or leave it or whatever. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just gonna say it, but I do think this is just this chapter is another example of him making clear this isn't inevitable. it isn't a historical fact prior, but it was intentional urban and city planning that led to the way that we have experienced our cities now. So it's another, like, I think he's really doing a lot of that in this, and that's the only other thing I'd add. Yeah.
I'm going to preface this statement by the fact that
the word intentional was something
John, go ahead, and then
John,
I think
go ahead.
Sam's internet was a little lag, so Sam, you can go next.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm going to preface this statement by the fact that I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a liberal college, and I studied under a lot of history professors that were pretty liberal. I remember hearing in college in the early 80s and late 70s that one of the reasons why they wanted to, why the government and powers that be wanted to keep poor people, a poor class of people, was so that they had people to go to war. And that if you had a group of people that was oppressed and who was poor, you could put them into the army and let them go to war for you. And that they were able, and if you looked at the Vietnam War, that's what happened to a lot of poor African Americans. They were disproportionately sent into Vietnam as grunts. And it made a lot of sense to me in college. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a kind of theory of state formation that, like, basically the state is almost always a kind of imaginative reality. Like, there's a fabulous book by a guy, I'm trying to remember, I think it's Benedict Anderson, but it's called Imagined Communities. And the argument is that the state is always trying to, it's always sort of a project for the future. But one of the central functions of the state is to create the citizenry that it wants. And so it creates laws precisely to do that. And that's one of the reasons why those laws wind up surfacing certain ways of being and suppressing other ways of being, et cetera. So it wouldn't surprise me if this were the case. And I think particularly in the United States, one of the troubling factors of our existence is that we've been pretty much at war for most of the existence that we've been around in one way or another. Now, we haven't been in major wars all along the way, but there have been constant skirmishes and things like that. So war has been somewhat central to who we are. And so it wouldn't surprise me. I would have to, you want to look at that, and these are obviously theories that can have counterfactuals that sort of question you or make you want to not be too pushy on that. But I do think, I mean, war tends to be ultimately politics and economics by another means. It's not just about the violence. There are other goals usually that are spread under there. So I myself, like I said, the other one is my theory. It's not the church's theory or anybody else's theory. It's just the theory that I've sort of thought about through my own reflection and study. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there was some truth to what you're talking about, John. I haven't run into that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, I did not go to the University of Wisconsin, but I was in college at the same time that John was, and same conversation. I was taught, and it line up with slavery. You need bodies to go to Vietnam, and they're vulnerable, and we trade it. Again, we use these people like collateral. There was just a couple of things I wanted to ask, point out and ask. Page of paragraph, it states that the central purpose of the 14th Amendment was, well, I'll back up. The court majority was enamored of the idea that the central purpose of the 14th Amendment was not to protect the rights of freed slaves, but a business rule, freedom of contract. I don't know if you've seen the documentary, The Corporation. How corporations got their rights is that attorneys used the 14th Amendment so that corporations enjoy the same rights as individuals. So if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. We used to use it in ethics courses. But then on the top of page 52, to Sarah's point, I had written down plan equals a control device. Planning, zoning was necessary, Bettman and his colleagues explained, quote, to maintain the nation and the race. So,
Thanks, Sam. I think the Bill or Lee, I'm not sure who's all on for this the strings, but I think Bill, maybe you were trying to offer a comment.
He was. Hang on.
Hi, Bill and
There we
Lee.
go. Okay.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
So my first job out of college was working for the Urban Renewal Administration. And part of urban renewal, we had to learn about public housing. And we went down to, so we were stationed in Philadelphia. And there were some new high-rise public housing facilities built in Washington, DC, which we went down to visit. And it was amazing that these apartments were concrete with drains in the floor. You couldn't hang anything on the walls because they were all cement. You need a jackhammer to drive a nail in. Anyway, the thing that amazed me was the public housing had its own rules that only low-income people could live there. And once your income got over the maximum, you had to move out. And the people that got raises were the community workers who were the Boy Scout masters and the Little League coaches and the basketball coaches. That brought all these people together that you know, there was camaraderie. And they get driven out because they did well at work and they got raises, and that's the end of public housing for you. So they had these rules that kept those who weren't talented or interested all ganged up in the same place. It was very sad.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just gonna say in a couple of the housing developments I lived in, people wouldn't get married because they would have lost the ability to stay in the public housing. And so it was like this interesting thing of, you know, growing up in the church and like, you should be married, but like, you'll make just a little bit too much to stay in public housing, you know, but also, yeah, so, thanks for sharing that though, Bill.
That's was really, that's
quite
really
an
a
experience.
powerful anecdote. And from that chapter on public housing, I feel like there are a couple little bits and pieces, like little crumbs that are not developed, but that they fit really well with what you're sort of pointing at, Bill, which is that initially public housing doesn't have a cap on it. Like there's not really a limit, you know, in terms of what you can make to live, but over time that's imposed. And I think one of the things about this book that's interesting is that we find that sort of what we might call racialized or kind of maybe systemic racism, it's not like a lockstep thing, it's like a patchwork. And so one of the deductions I think that Rothstein argues is that given the suppression of wages of African Americans, they're the ones who are going to be less likely to get the kind of raises that would enable them to move out. And of course, the question is, where exactly would they move? And that's one of the processes that seems to create, that kind of winds up concentrating them in public housing. But I think the human toll that you put your finger on is extremely important, because it's oftentimes the very people who are doing a lot of the community building, right, who wind up being effective also at their jobs, and wind up getting raises, and then wind up getting kicked out into other kinds of settings and situations. And
Right.
thank you very much for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Should we move to,
Yeah,
should
our
we
time
move to
is really,
4?
our time is really flying.
I
I
know.
was like,
Well,
I
I
remember,
figured you're gonna do 4, and then we'll be like, and the rest are like that. Let's go to the end and talk about possible fixes, considering fixes.
well, I don't have as many, so I don't have as many pages marked in chapter
In 4?
4. This really does tell the story, though, about FHA guidelines,
Oh, yep.
which I do think is really important. So Federal Housing Authority, and kind of the different acronyms that had, and whether or not they would back certain kinds of mortgages.
Mhm.
And I think the basic premise of this chapter is one that we probably all of us know pretty well, which is owning your own home is indeed the best pathway for building up family and generational wealth. And that effectively, certainly from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that this was basically denied to African Americans.
Mhm.
And I think, to me, it's this chapter
Mhm.
in particular that gives us kind of the biggest sort of kind of clue, like watermark clue, fingerprint for what we would call the wealth gap. Like, why is there such a massive wealth gap? And I know that my family, like, I wouldn't, I think we were talking earlier, and we were talking about like how these different kind of programs, maybe from the New Deal and things like that, have affected different of our families. I don't think I would have been where I am had I not received those kinds of benefits. And so, so this chapter really does kind of highlight that kind of exclusionary policy, and it does so precisely the way that Sam talked about, which is often driven by a need to appease certain kinds of groups to make sure that something like this goes forward. So there's a kind of tragic component here, but still contingent.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there are
Yeah.
passages or sections of this that stick out to you.
I think one of the things is, and this begins to be part of what in more popular, like, I think more popularly people have heard of as redlining. Like, this is where that begins to build the case for how that plays out. And with the way that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, beginning in the 30s, goes through and color codes different neighborhoods according to the perceived risk of the neighborhood. And they do this, like, for instance, it's not actually based off of economics, even it's based off of race. And so they cite, like, on 64, how, like, in St. Louis, like a neighborhood that's a middle class suburb gets coded as green because there's not a single foreigner or Negro. But a middle class suburban area in Lincoln Terrace, so they're both middle class, like class wise, economic wise, job wise, they're actually the same, but it gets coded red, which is danger zone for mortgages, which is where redlining, right? Like, because African Americans live there. And so I think, this chapter, like, again, it begins to outline too the way that, even thinking about, like, again, the story I heard, because, like, I mean, like, World War II, like, we saved the world, like, it's really good, and everyone comes home, and then, like, everyone gets loans, and then, like, St. Louis Park becomes a neighborhood, and, like, all this housing, and, like, like, my mom's born in 58, and so, like, this is all like, yay, good, and then you're like, wait, what? Like, not everyone got veterans loans? Like, I thought if you were a veteran, you got a loan. Like, that was just, like, what happened. And so I think, this is where they're also, Like he keeps building these sorts of things to show again that this actually like you just couldn't get a loan if you're a Black veteran. Like it wasn't going to happen for you. And so and just the ways that this continues to say like I've got my first home loan was a Freddie and Franny, whoever insured my, I clearly paid attention to that, but literally I got my first loan in 2009 for a house, and our literal banker at the time, because we were buying in Minneapolis, he goes, "Oh, we have this special program to help go against the history of redlining." This is me like just naively not thinking through this until later. And he goes, "But you two are people that we know if we give you this special loan, we know that you'll be able to continue to pay on it." Because they had put in place funding from the federal government to counteract the effects of redlining. So this loan set is supposed to go to African Americans. Like that's actually what it's supposed to help with, is the way that, and he's like, "But you two," which, if spoiler alert, if you haven't paid attention, Andy and I are both white, but it didn't occur to me. I was just like, "Oh, cool. I get like a cool, better loan deal." Because we didn't have to pay any interest on our loan. It was like a special, sort of thing. So that's what he's starting to do in this chapter, again, to just keep outlining both what you're saying of the way that the wealth gap gets put in place, but again, how this is where redlining really begins to take effect. And just seeing like there's that one part where it talks about like a white dude who bought a house in a green area, and then he like couldn't be there, and so he like rented to a Black guy. And then it was like 1959. I was like, my mom was 1 year old, and he got barred by the Federal Housing Administration. They're like, "We will not give you future loans because you basically cheated the system and gave your house to a Black guy." And I'm like, 1959? Like, I mean, I think those are some of the moments in this book where, it's like, this isn't just 1877. So that's just so that's kind of,
and for me, I'm sorry, sir. When you share these things and others of you are sharing, what I keep reminding myself is that, and this entire practice, all of it goes against Supreme Court ruling. But no one seems to care. Everyone is, so it's one of those things that's really concerning to me. Like if the Supreme Court says something and it's against the law, but you don't have individuals willing to then abide by the law, this is an example of it, even though the Supreme Court said, stop it. It didn't matter.
Michelle, would you kind of, this actually, like the comment that you mentioned in your thing, it moves us into the next chapter. So we have this first chapter, and I think so. One of the things I think is really powerful about this book is the feeling that you get of the patchwork nature of discrimination and exclusion and racism. That's extraordinarily effective. Like it's clearly systemically effective, but it's also a patchwork. So in this first, that chapter we were just talking about is the FHA questions, but then the next chapter has to do with exclusive racial covenants. And then the chapter after, we hear a little bit about local tactics, which actually coincides with some of the stuff, Michelle, that I know you're familiar with mapping prejudice. And sort of like, why do we put 35W where we put it? Why is 94 where we put it, et cetera? I think those are, so I mean, I know we're kind of getting time here. I'd love to hear some thoughts on that, Michelle, because I know you've got some knowledge in that regard.
Yeah, is anyone else familiar with mapping prejudice? Have you heard of that? Yeah, you have. Have you participated in it? Have you gotten trained? And so it's from the University of Minnesota, and they started with Hennepin County, and now they're Ramsey County, and they had a bunch of volunteers that scanned mortgage deeds, and then they trained people. Like I went to this church in Minneapolis where they just showed us how to do it, and then I showed my dad how to do it. So like anyone can do it. It's pretty easy. But you just set up an account, and then you get documents kind of sent to you that you go through and you look for the racial covenant and language, and then you highlight it if it is. And then what they're doing is they're mapping the prejudice, literally, like they're showing a map and showing how if you look around the lakes, you know, it's pretty white. Yeah, and so I sent Sarah this this ad. So I live right now around Lake of the Isles, near Lake of the Isles, about a half mile. But you can see the last paragraph there says the party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, Semitic, or African blood or descent. And so, and we found when we were doing the Hennepin County, we found that all over Edina. Like a friend of mine was doing it, and she's like, that was my neighborhood. And I walked my Chinese daughters, you know, to the park in that neighborhood. And 40 years ago, 50 years ago, they wouldn't have been allowed to live there. So it's a really cool project that I'm happy to show anybody how to do it. I think Sarah put the link in the chat for it, but yeah, it really brings it right to home. And there are some homes in Minneapolis that have now kind of put up a sign or put up a marker that says a Black family used to live here and they were run out of town by the white neighbors, you know. And so yeah, it's a cool thing. It's sad, but it's cool.
And Michelle, can you comment about sort of some of the process that happens with the construction of 35W94? Do you have some?
Yeah, I don't know that much. So I did mention to Christian, part of what they ask you to do before you start doing the mapping prejudice project is to watch. It's a PBS documentary called Jim Crow of the North. I believe it's just on YouTube. And they talk about how 35 and 94 intentionally went, you know, like the highways are not near where the lakes are. They're not near where, you know, the nice parks and things are. So they went through very established neighborhoods. One of the hardest hit neighborhoods is the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul. And that was a very close community. And when they went through there, those people lost their homes. You know, the government might give them some money, but it's certainly not enough money for them to go and get more money or get another house. And so a lot of people literally lost their housing because of how we decided to put in our transit and highway system.
Yeah, and I, just to add a couple, like a little bit of a layer, like connecting it to the book, if you can get up into, particularly up into chapters, like if you can read along and you get up into chapter 8 around local tactics, you really get this, like, I mean, it's hard to be shocked, but it is still shocking where basically you have a process, right, of dispossession, of zoning areas so that they should only, like this area should be white, this area should be black, making it very difficult for African Americans to gain low interest loans, which seems to ensure that they're not going to have enough money to be able to keep up their property, which means that wherever they're going to be concentrated is going to over time deteriorate and degrade. And then you have the phenomenon of slums. And so how are we going to get rid of slums? Well, one of the tools we're going to use is precisely the interstate highway projects that are going on in the 50s and 60s. And of course, you combine white flight with that. And so the places where 94 and 35W are certainly put in, they're put in historically African-American neighborhoods, but these are neighborhoods that were created by earlier processes. Like in Minneapolis, like from some of the things I've read, particularly about Edina and South Minneapolis, effectively, like it's pretty racially integrated. Like there's not a lot of diversity necessarily, but people can kind of live wherever for the most part if they can afford it. And that situation changes pretty much from like the time frame we've been talking about, 1890s, 1920s. There's a wonderful, like a marvelous little essay that I was given regarding that process and how it developed in Edina. And it just kind of helped me understand sort of the way that Edina came into being. But I mean, prior to the 1920s, Edina is known as effectively an interracial village. And so basically people wind up getting sequestered in these areas, and part of the argument of that article is it's not just that that people from the South are coming up, because this is the time of the first Great Migration and they're settling in one area. It's that they're coming up, they can only settle in that area, and then other people from across the cities can no longer live in those areas, and they're also being put in there. And then about 30, 40 years later, because of the degradation, because of the lack of investment, because of redlining, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, this winds up being an area that needs to be cleaned up, and the interstate process becomes one of the tools that gets used. And that's what I tend to think about when I think about systemic racism. That's what I tend to think. Again, a patchwork of decisions that are not necessarily connected, but that wind up having a cascade of effects that are significantly, like, it's just impossible to avoid. Yeah, and so the school question, healthcare question, access to good food, environmental issues around, like healthy air and water and things like that, all that stuff gets tied in. So
just going to add to that, housing and COVID, the African American incidence of that because of crowded housing. There was an article in the September issue of Minneapolis St. Paul magazine about Sandra Samuelson, who some of you may know, and it's a talk about her and her husband Don Samuelson and the work that they're doing in North Minneapolis and why they chose to stay there. And there's quite a bit about housing, and she talks about the mapping project of the Jim Crow of the North, and she also mentions this book and said that there is a book there is a short film about this book called Segregated by Design. So it's at segregatedbydesign.com, and it's about this book, this author and his book. Have any of you seen that?
no, I'd love to see that.
I read the article a couple weeks ago, and then I just realized there's all this housing stuff, and there's a list of resources, and it mentions the mapping project, the Jim Crow, the North, and then this one. So just another resource to reinforce this information.
Yeah, so any of you who couldn't read the book and you're not sure if you're going to be able to, this is like crib notes. Come on. Yeah, this is like crib notes, man. And there you go. You get the basic gist. Elaine?
I just want to mention another project is called Just Deeds. And Golden Valley, where we live in the Tyrone Hills area, and apparently there were deeds that were restrictive. And so I sent in my request to have the deed reviewed and any restrictive covenants eliminated. Now it's no longer legal, but it's just something to do and act as an individual to make sure that it's cleaned out, and also to find out if there is a restrictive covenant still on the deed.
Well, I know we're coming down to the end here.
Yep.
I
just posted that in the comments as well, Elaine, from Golden Valley. What y'all are doing there. Yeah.
Well, we got through half the book.
We got through the book.
We pretty much did. I mean, we kind of hit most of the high points. I think you kind of see. Sarah, did you have any?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to, I mean, we didn't actually get through the book because I think actually for those of you who have personalities at all like mine, you're like, okay, like that's a lot, and wanting to continue to wrestle with, I think, and especially, for us as a church and as people of faith, like, what do I do with this? And so I think, a lot of I'm still doing my doctorate in ethics, and one of the big things is like getting a sense of what is what is the real. And I think that obligation, you know, as Christ followers, to be intentional about trying to understand the situations, like how we got to where we are, and then to prayerfully discern, what do I do in view of this? And so I think, you know, a big part of this book is trying to say, you know, he's making that argument. This isn't an inevitability. This was put together. Let's be honest. This is painful. But if we can, one of the things I love what he does in this book at the beginning and at the end is he says, if we can understand that this is created, it also can be uncreated. And we can do build a different future together. And the sense of that will take all of us, and there are different things we can do to be intentional about this. And so I think that's, you know, half of it is the being able to look fiercely in the face of things that are hard, and then to sit with that and prayerfully discern, you know, what we can do. So in chapter 12, and then also in his frequently asked questions, you know, I appreciate that he's not like, oh, and here's the simple fix and everything will be great and amazing. And all of us are like, why didn't we have that button before? He's like, no, this is complex. You know, there are really hard things, but it's going to be imprecise, but we actually can work on these sorts of things. And the sense of a call, that it's a call to all of us, that it's, you know, it's something that as a whole country and as a whole nation that we actually can work on. And so like, if zoning was made one way, well, then zoning can be made differently. And, you know, so even like in St. Louis Park, because I was on the Human Rights Commission in St. Louis Park until I started going to too many council meetings. And so, but that was part of it, was like we would interact with our city zoning and city zoning commission to talk about like how was zoning happening in St. Louis Park, and was it equitable and just. And so like there's these different ways that he both suggests in the book. There's some parts, actually, Elaine, what you were mentioning, he actually in the FAQs has a section. It's like, hey, how can I find out if my neighborhood had a racial covenant and what can I do with that? So he has some great things, I think, in the frequently asked questions about this. And I think just a sense of like, you know, what's the world we want to create together? But I think he's saying you don't need to be hopeless in view of this. We can actually prayerfully discern. And some of you are involved in these things. Like we can be involved in housing. We can be involved in local jurisdiction related to zoning. We can be involved in asking these questions about ethics and really being intentional about it. And just also by us knowing about these things as Christ followers, like as then we're building relationships, like with the Samuelsons or others who are doing good work in other places in the city, having that awareness impacts how we show up. And so I think that's, you know, kind of this piece of the sense of how for us wrapping up tonight is a sense of like, in view of this history, just that continued prayerful discernment. And so I just thought what we could do is just end in a moment of silence, of collectively inviting God's Spirit to just open up before us ways, you know, whatever this looks like, for us to continue to participate in showing up in the world as the church. And John has a comment he wants to offer before we get to any intentional reflective prayer at the end, but then we'll wrap with that. Go ahead, John.
Thank
hold
you
it.
very much. I enjoy it, but I have to go.
Okay, bye.
All right, bye.
Thank you. I'll pray for you as you go. So let's just close then in a moment of, I'll invite God's Spirit again, just to the four of our minds, because God's Spirit's already with us, and then we'll have a moment of silence as we close. So God, you know that, man, standing in the face of things that are really painful and can be excruciating and overwhelming. For some of us, maybe it's energizing, and some of us it's like, can I just take a long nap and hope your kingdom comes someday soon. So God, we just do pray that in view of this, that you by your Spirit, even in this moment, in these coming days, might breathe in us, that we might listen for your invitation. So let's just take a minute, oh Spirit, that you might continue to open us. We're here to listen. God, there are so many ways, both as individuals and as societies and as people, that we do indeed fall short of your glory and your call to us. But God, we also give you thanks for your grace, which is constantly inviting and healing and renewing and redeeming. So might we be more transformed into your image, that our hearts might be broken for the things that break yours, and that the places where we are in need of things being opened up, God, might you give us courage, that we might know that we're held by your Spirit and your great love. So God, for these people gathered here tonight, and for the ability to be your church and to be your people, we give you great thanks. And God, we pray indeed that these legacies, God, that they might be healed, that people might have life and food and housing that is safe and that honors them as your children. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.